All right. Hi there. I'm Rachel Karpinski, and today I'll be discussing how climate change has impacted regions of the wet tropics of the world, and if unmanaged, how it is predicted to advance in the future. All right, and let's get started. So, without a doubt, climate change is occurring across the globe, and it is primarily due to anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. For instance, carbon dioxide emissions are more than 12 times greater today than they were 100 years ago. Since then, temperatures have risen at least 0.6 degrees Celsius and are continuing to increase. This has resulted in many direct and indirect changes to the environment. The greatest and most complex issue, and the one that I'll probably be focusing on the most today, is the effects of biodiversity. The wet tropics is a biodiversity hotspot of the globe with global significance. The World Heritage Area, for example, is dominated by mountain ranges varying from sea level to over 1,600 meters. And altitude is the main environmental driver for determining species composition and patterns of biodiversity. And climate change is now playing a threat to these regions. Now, there are likely a huge variation in the vulnerability of different species to the impacts of climate change, but for the less resilient species, climate change has been known to be directly related to shifts in species distribution and range, earlier migration breeding, and variation in life history traits such as cluster size. Vegetation growth is affected directly by the changing concentrations of atmospheric gases, primarily CO2, and also indirectly by the influence of changing gas composition on regional climate and local weather. Current indications are that the global agricultural production will not decline significantly with doubling of CO2 concentrations. However, the direct and indirect effects of rising CO2 may have significant consequences for regional production that would require adapting crops and crop varieties grown, as well as agricultural management practices. Climate change is also expected to have an impact on hydrological systems as well because of changing precipitation, temperature, and evaporation, all of which are primary inputs for the terrestrial part of the water cycle. So, why is this important? A paper written in 2008 by Williams and Isaac stated, "Assessing the impact of climate change on global biodiversity is a research issue of global importance and great challenge to ecologists. It is now widely recognized that climate change is one of the most significant current threats to biodiversity worldwide, and contemporary research indicates that significant effects of climate change are already apparent in a variety of taxa and ecosystems. Therefore, with that said, it is crucial to determine which species and areas are most at risk in order to appropriately take action and mitigate the impacts. In particular, species that are in isolated locations or species that have limited dispersal ability are thought to be most at risk. So as suited to the suitable environment will be, as their suitable environment will be reduced. So the wet tropics of Queensland World Heritage Area was used as a case study to show the impacts of climate change on global biodiversity. And their long-term monitoring highlighted declines in distribution and populations of many rainforest species. In this case study, habitat connectivity was proven to play an important role for species needing to move to different altitudes. This means that some species will be impacted in times where connectivity does not exist because of forest fragmentation. This study characterizes species only found in the cooler, higher altitude parts of the region as the most vulnerable because scientists were able to predict that under high greenhouse gas emissions, upland environments may disappear entirely by year 2070. With that being said, upland flora is also predicted to decline by a minimum of 63% and up to 100% by 2040. Another study examining the abundance of endemic rainforest birds also revealed 44% decline in upland rainforest specialists and endemics. Bioclimatic models suggest that climate change will have catastrophic events on many of the region's endemic vertebrate species. Based on current distribution range limits, an increase in regional average temperatures of 1.0 degrees Celsius could decrease the distribution range of the region's endemic vertebrate species by 60%. The projected warming of the magnitude also predicted a loss of approximately 65% of wet tropics endemic vertebrates. This implies a strong likelihood of approximately 50% of 50 species becoming globally extinct from the wet tropics World Heritage Area, with only a model average temperature increase. A case study on the microphyllid frog species, for example, indicated that dispersal events over distances of 1 kilometer were very rare. Their inability to avoid climate changing, even just 1 degree Celsius, will likely result in the extinction of several frog species. Some of the wet tropic mammals, such as the green ring-tailed possum, have proven to be intolerant to temperatures over 30 degrees Celsius, and their body temperature increasing above that temperature may even have lethal effects just being exposed for 4 to 5 hours. Climate change will also likely increase the number and intensity of disturbance events such as fires, droughts, and cyclones in the wet tropics, which will place higher stress on the native species and ecosystems. Weeds, which often outcompete native species, are already one of the most serious threats to Australian biodiversity. There is likely a huge pool of invasive species available to colonize in these bare spaces. Vines and woody invasive species that are shade tolerant and recruit from the seedling areas may constitute the greatest threat to the wet tropics following severe storms. And here are some figures from these previous studies. On the left, you can see how species richness of endemic vertebrates in the wet tropics decreases as temperature increases. And on the right is the same thing, but you're looking specifically at frog species, and you can clearly see that the abundance decreases as temperature increases. So what do we know? We know that there is little research effort focused on the potential of behavioral and genetic adaptations to mitigate effects of rapid climate changes on animal populations. And we know that without strong intervention to prevent global climate change, the wet tropics will continue to be impacted by climate stressors. Climate stressors including air temperature change, which meaning higher minimum temperatures and maximum temperatures. A change in wind, so stronger trade winds, hydrology and occult precipitation, more frequent severe droughts, higher evaporation, more extreme rainfall, more intense tropical cyclones. Water temperature increases, and so does the acidity. Storm surges, changes in sea level, and other abiotic factors. So, moving forward, policy and management can help support the wet tropics to cope with climate change. First, we can establish inclusive regional adaptation planning frameworks. This will entail developing a comprehensive science and innovative research framework and implement in order to support long-term adaptive management. We can also take action to improve landscape resilience. This will include identifying and protecting high-risk species and ecosystems, implement strategic management of invasive species and diseases, and implement appropriate fire regimes for fire-sensitive ecosystems, such as rainforests. We can facilitate transition to adaptive communities and industries. This means that we can pursue options to increase collaborative research into the current and future states of wet tropics natural systems, including identifying indirect impacts of climate change on communities and regional economies through change in ecosystem services. This also means that we can seek and promote opportunities for cultural, social, and economic co-benefits of building adaptive capacity in natural systems, including green infrastructure, ecosystem-based emergency management, biodiversity offsets, and carbon sequestration programs. Lastly, and possibly most important, future research in the wet tropics needs to focus on behavioral and genetic adaptations and incorporate long-term species-specific data encompassing the ecology and physiology of the species. Contemporary modeling techniques and controlled experiment manipulation are very necessary. And yeah, those are my references, and I thank you for your time.